Welcome, everyone. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Today, we're going to talk about justice for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. We're going to have a session opens May 22nd, and we have a program on May 21st at noon about it. Okay, I'm going to, we have a disclaimer. As you know, all the comments of the moderator is me, so I will speak on behalf of the center, but our guests represent their perspectives and do not represent the official position of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. So I'm going to switch gears. Acts of violence against the Asian American community, including recent hate-fed murders that we've seen in Atlanta and violence across the country, have tragically become all too common in our country. This increase in discrimination has been caused by a range of factors, including incitement to violence from our national leaders who have manipulated fear about the coronavirus and used scapegoating as a tactic. As a history museum, the center recognizes that this discrimination has a through line in our country's history. And it is all too easy to connect the historical dots of exclusion and othering of Asian Americans in history to the violence and harassment we see today. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prevented immigration on the basis of race, the first time the US had a law to do that. In the early 20th century, Chinese immigrants were detained and forced to undergo medical examinations and interrogations. Throughout the Second World War, Hawaii was under martial law, and we know about the Americans of Japanese descent being held in internment camps during the war with unfounded suspicion of disloyalty. The list goes on for a range of Asian American communities. We see surges of xenophobia during times of broader instability and insecurity, where a dominant population looks for a target and a scapegoat. COVID has been manipulated in such a way, as have threats in the past. So we have three guests today to talk about the legacy of anti-Asian discrimination, how that's playing out today and its impact. And I hope they'll have some thoughts for us about what can be done to address it. Ellen Ahn is the Executive Director of Korean Community Services, a community health center and social service organization in Los Angeles. She's also a dear friend, I won't say old friend, a dear friend of mine. So I'm delighted that she's with us for a program at the center. Mary Ann Fu is the founder and executive director of Orange County Asian and Pacific Islander Community Alliance. Her organization focuses on health, policy, civic engagement, and education for diverse and underserved communities. Priscilla Huang is a senior attorney at the National Health Law Program, where she focuses on reproductive health and justice issues in Medicaid, as well as immigrant access to health care. Prior to joining the National Health Law Program, Priscilla was a consultant and senior advisor with the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the Obama administration. Thank you all so much for taking time out to join us for this conversation. I'll direct questions to sometimes all of you, sometimes one of you, but please, let's make this more of a conversation. I'd love this to be for you all to ask each other questions as well. So to start, each of you is a leader in an organization that serves the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in a variety of ways. I'd like you to give our listeners and viewers a sense of what your organizations focus on right now and how this climate is affecting the people that you serve. What are you seeing and hearing from the communities that you work with? And Ellen, I'll start with you.
Well, we are seeing trauma upon trauma last year. 2020 was really a year of the trauma of COVID and navigating, especially immigrant, limited English proficient communities, navigating a pandemic, everything that's involved in a pandemic, from testing to vaccinations to losing your job, to everything the tumult the nation has experienced. But then also being fearful of getting beaten up or watching these horrific news stories. When the Atlanta murders happened, I our community, and we are 2,000 miles away here in Orange County, California, we were not stunned. We were really, we just felt like that could have been us. And that is us. Those women look like us. The women look like the people we serve. So it has been a really, really tough year for Asian communities. Personally, it's it's been a tumult of emotions between anger, vindication, sadness, a lot of those emotions that I juggle on a personal level as an Asian woman, um, while trying to be a leader in my community.
Talk about vindication for a minute. It's that you've been talking about this and working on this, I know, for 30 years.
Yeah, and finally, we're having a conversation about injustices and systemic discrimination, things we felt for 30 years, but now it's out in the open and in the media. It's that is really quite wonderful. I guess the silver lining in all of this.
Yeah. Marianne?
Hi, for Okapica, we were started because of hate crimes. And in 1996, there was a hate crime against a young man, Tianmin Lee. And we're in a county it's about 25% Asian American and Pacific Islander. And I think it was shocking for this to happen because we're thinking, oh, we have so many Asian Americans, but Tianmin Lee was attacked and stabbed over 90 times on on a high school tennis court. He had been skating and he had come home from grad school. And the only reason why they found his killers is because one of the killers wrote to his cousin, "Oh, I killed a Jap a while ago and it was great. And I stabbed him and did this and this, and he begged for his life and it was so funny. And I cut his throat." So that violent crime happened. At the same time, the police were stopping Asian American youth and taking pictures of them, mugshots, and saying, if you're driving a white Honda, you are in a gang. And if you're wearing baggy clothes, you're in a gang. And so their civil rights were violated. And many of these young people were, honor students. And then welfare reform was happening. And at the time, President Clinton started welfare reform. And we just saw all this hate bubble up because as the community was saying, it's going to be really hard for non-English speaking to find jobs right now. What are we going to do? We saw all this hate come out in the media, in the community. I remember the headline saying "Big refugee ripoff. These Vietnamese refugees live off of welfare and then they drive Mercedes." So it's all these, stereotypes, this information, this hate was occurring. You see it happening throughout history. I remember growing up with this in the 80s, and it was all the anti-Japanese cars, and Vincent Chin was killed. And so it just brought trauma upon trauma for the community, as well as murders and deaths and attacks. And so when we started, we experienced that and we addressed that. And now it's like, right now, it's like going back in time, it's going back in history. And I think it's really impacting our communities, our staff. But I think just like what Ellen said, we all need to step up right now. And because of social media, we're able to record it better. We're able to create discussions nationwide and internationally too about what's happening. And so the technology and communication has enabled us to activate better and organize better. And so I think that's the difference now. And I think that's where we can have a bigger impact right now.
And then just because a lot of the folks who tune into this work in NGOs, lead NGOs, how are you doing as a leader of an NGO right now, personally and professionally?
I think personally, if we didn't have each other, if I couldn't call Ellen or Priscilla, and then nationally, Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Atlanta has been leading so much, in Georgia. We have Asian Americans Advancing Justice nationally, National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and so many groups, stop AAPI hate.org. I think we're all getting together and talking. And it's like a support group to be able to say, what are you doing? How are you taking action? But how are you doing personally? Because it is overwhelming. And every time you see someone hurt, just recently in San Francisco, the two older adult women who were stabbed, you know, that could be my mother, that could be our grandmother, that could be us. And every time that happens, every time we see someone on the New York subway attacked or in a store attacked, it's we're thinking that's us, and it's just devastating. Um, so we constantly have to be supporting each other because we just see the burnout. We see people just like, I can't take this anymore. So that support. So if you work for an NGO, if you just really support each other, and I know even folks who are not in the Asian American community are things are coming up for the Jewish communities, for for Black communities, it's even more impactful because just so much going on right now for the Black communities and Latinx communities, same thing. So I think so many communities have experienced hate that this is just bringing up more of those past feelings and hurts.
Yeah. Priscilla?
Hi, Jill, and thank you so much for including me as part of this discussion. I have to apologize to the audience that I'm not on video. I'm unfortunately having some connectivity issues, so hopefully being able to listen to me more clearly makes up for that. But thank you for the question. I think I'm wearing two hats in this discussion. I am part of a national nonprofit organization called National Health Law Program. We protect and advance health rights for low income individuals, and we do that through policy advocacy and through litigation. And so, we are not a direct service provider in the way that Ellen and Marianne's groups are, but we are trying to do our part in terms of supporting more meaningful access to, for example, COVID vaccinations. Last week, we filed a administrative complaint against the Departments of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, to try to improve the way that limited English proficient individuals are able to get information, make appointments, and be able to get the COVID vaccine. Right now, that is a fundamental human rights issue in our country. And traditionally, people who are not English proficient, I feel, have often been treated as a second class, as an afterthought in terms of these large public health outreach attempts like we're doing right now. And the other hat that I'm wearing is through an organization called Asian Americans in Action, which is a group also focused on Orange County, California, but building connections with other parts of the state and throughout the country in terms of connecting folks who really are dedicated and focused on building power within Asian American communities, to elevating our voices and really centering Asian Americans in policymaking decisions. And so through that space, the question that the follow-up question that you were asking us about how we're doing personally, I think it has been really hard. I think one of the things that's really struck me recently was that in a lot of ways I'm reliving the childhood traumas that I had, but it's very different thinking about that through as an adult, experiencing those traumas and those racist incidents as an adult, now that I have, an understanding of, white supremacy frameworks and, all of the education and self-learning and unlearning that I've had to do over the years versus experiencing them as a child and not really understanding the historical context for why these things were happening to me. And so every time, like Marianne mentioned, every time I see another news article or actually what's been happening locally here is harassment from neighbors. So a lot of residential based incidents where next door neighbors or other people within the vicinity harassing other Asian American families that was my experience as a child. And, our home being vandalized, and, seeing that repeated so close to where I live now has been triggering and traumatizing. And at the same time, I'm also feeling some optimism. I feel like our collective rage is galvanizing us in ways that it hasn't before. I feel like historically, Asian Americans, we were not allowed to feel that rage. Asians were not seen as people of color. And so in the past, when we were trying to do advocacy as Asian Americans, it was very challenging to do so. But now there's an effort to center our voices, to listen to our demands, and to really show up and support us.
Yeah, it's been, I mean, I mentioned vindication earlier. It's been a powerful year too. I'm a little older, Jill, and this moment feels very different. And so all the pain we experience is coming out in rising up and saying no more. And actually we are seeing the needle move a little, which is not something we have experienced in the last 30 years. And, I hearken, I don't want to play off stereotypes, but our parents told us to be invisible, assimilate, study hard, don't make trouble, don't make good trouble. So we did as children and experienced all this trauma, and many of us studied really hard and are very successful in different places. And actually they positioned us really well for this moment, because there are leaders in entertainment, in business, in the nonprofit sector that have experienced this collective trauma together over their childhoods and are saying no more at this moment. And this moment feels, it's for me personally, it's incredibly empowering. Despite all the sadness of it all, it's saying, yeah, you're doing a presentation on a better world for children. You did that in the very beginning. I do see a better world for my son. If many of us do the right thing at this moment.
Yeah, do you feel like, just because we tell the story of the US civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s in this country, that's what our museum has as our premier exhibition. Do you feel like you're tapping into that kind of moment right now? Do you feel that kind of energy, that these kinds of, and there are always these inciting incidents that drive those movements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we it does feel like that moment. And I personally am indebted to the young people these days. They have given all of us a vocabulary to really enunciate what many of us have felt over decades. And they have really changed the culture of this country from what I know in the 80s and 90s. And so, yes, this is a very unique moment in Asian American history.
Yeah, Marianne, did you want to add on that?
I agree. I totally agree with what Ellen and Priscilla are saying. And I think this next generation of our young people have been so inspiring, and really pushing our community in addressing hate. And I think it started with Black Lives Matter and the inspiration from that for our young people, and to start to even question our own racism within our communities, with Black people. And so with our communities getting involved with Black Lives Matter and really talking about race, racial justice, and narrative building, and what does it mean to us as a community, that really helped us to prepare, I think, and have discussions and have really honest discussions about what's happening to us during the pandemic, and scapegoating and blame, and to talk about the history in the US and going back to civil rights, and even before that in the Chinese Exclusion Act and so many other things, and how all communities have been impacted. So it has been that new generation who have not been who haven't been able who haven't swallowed, and stayed silent or ignored that these things are happening to you or just walk away. They're not doing that, and I think that's what's inspiring to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sorry, I have a dog barking in the background. We're it's all live here.
Sorry, Jill.
And a mother. Sorry about that. The discrimination in history is not taught in this country. The Chinese Exclusion Act is not a common historical lesson that people take forward. Do you think there is a way to tell the truth of history about what's happened to Asian Americans in a different way? Is that part of this? I'll throw that over to Priscilla.
Thanks, Jill. Yes, I mean, absolutely. Part of why we're in this situation is, I think, because Asian Americans have been excluded or erased from US history. There are so many contributions that Asian immigrants and Asian Americans have made that, for me personally, I only learned about these either outside of school. I actually had a sixth grade teacher who pulled me aside one day and told me about Japanese internment. I had no idea that had happened, and she was white, and she was the one who first told me about that and gave me a book to read about it. And then, of course, I think a lot of us, a lot of Asian Americans, at least of my age, also learned about this through Asian American studies classes in college. So there's certainly having the history and the inclusion of Asian Americans as contributors and accomplishments, but also survivors of violence, of racial violence as well. That is also part of our history. The lynchings that happened, the burnings of Chinatowns across the United States, sometimes in the name of public health as well, which is exactly what we are encountering at this moment with people who appear to be of Chinese descent being scapegoats for carrying the coronavirus into the United States. So history repeats itself, right? That is why it is so important and fundamental for us to learn about it and to context. And I think also important to that is making sure that whatever history we do learn is contextualized in the broader civil rights movement, in solidarity struggles and cross movement building, all of the things that Marianne and Ellen were mentioning again earlier. And then I did want to just comment quickly about the role of assimilation, since that has come up. It comes up a lot in our community because as Ellen described, it was such a common experience for our parents or our grandparents to share, to tell us, keep your head down and work hard. And really, that was certainly true for myself as well. And for them, assimilation meant, being able to have peace of mind, being able to be left alone. Kathy Park Hong in her book, Minor Feelings, talks about that, and we're at a situation at a moment right now where assimilation is no longer protective. It doesn't matter how assimilated you are or how many generations your parents or your family has been in the United States. We are still seen as perpetual foreigners, first and foremost. And because of that, I do think, there is a lot that we have to thank our young people for. But I think one of the shifts that I've also seen in myself is, not just, stepping away from assimilation, but really finding joy and pride in being Asian American. It is claiming that heritage. It is creating a sense of belonging that where it's not enough for me to be part of, US society or in my community, and nobody's bothering me, and that's good enough for me. Now what I want for myself and for my children is to be seen for who I am as an Asian American woman. I want to be seen and recognized for the struggles that my family went through, and that other Asian immigrants before me went through. Um, and so I think that's a critical shift in the way that we see ourselves.
It's,
Wanted to
go ahead.
add to that if I could. In teaching, U.S. history or anything about the United States, um, I think it's really great and very vital to put in Asian American studies, but also within the context of other um, BIPOC communities. And the reason why is, there's a lot of history of working together, just like in the civil rights. But even in Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the first people to speak out against it was, the second African American U.S. senator, and he said he did not agree with this Chinese Exclusion Act. Or think about, the Mexican farm workers and the Japanese farm workers. When I think the white union farm workers invited the Mexican farm workers to join, they had strongly said, "We will not join until you allow our Japanese brothers to also join." And so they decided not to join because it didn't happen. That idea of allyship and working together, and that's a huge part of civil rights. And if our children knew about this, that we stood up for each other, that we did work together, and that everybody was fighting for the rights of all. When you uplift communities, everyone gets uplifted. And and so it's not just to talk about, well, this community was attacked or this community had no rights. I think these more positive stories about these communities came together and stood up for each other and fought for each other because it made a better US. And I'd like to see that. Also, compare and contrast. So we're not talking about the Armenian genocide, and that would be great to look at those similarities with the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian genocide. Um, Thinking beyond European history is really important. And then how to integrate all of these stories uh, of our communities into all sorts of not just history, not just English, but in math, in science. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that would help to shape and change the way that especially young people feel. And I heard from a lot of young people, oh, all I'm taught is I'm the enemy. We are just taught about the wars with, our countries of origin, but we're never taught about what we've done.
I think it's such an important point, and I love this conversation because we are a history museum, and the idea that what is that we're being manipulated in many ways by white supremacy. The whole tactic has been to divide and conquer among different groups who they don't align. And we have people have revelations when they come to our exhibitions to realize that this was a huge con, a huge manipulation of people to disempower all of us by turning groups against each other. And so we always find that young people in particular are floored by that's not just how it was, but was deliberate, systematic strategy to get poor Black and white farmers to turn on each other. Because if they allied, that would have been very bad for certain people. So I love what you're saying. This Dr. King called it the beloved community, the World House. We're all a part of this together. But I think let's recognize we have a huge challenge.
Yeah, I'm old enough to have lived through the LA riots, where the Korean community was pitted against the African American community, and the narrative 30 years ago was very different from the allyship that the Asian community feels with other BIPOC communities, and that's very powerful at this moment in time, and it is history evolving and understanding where we're at. I also, as Marianne and Priscilla so eloquently put, as they were speaking, I was thinking about this moment is very different because we have actually lived through some huge demographic shifts in the past few decades. Here in Orange County, we are a quarter Asian. That's not a number to sniff at anymore. And many of us sense this, but we are now flexing, I guess, our electoral strength. All the things that say, you can't other us and treat us invisible anymore. So that,
Yeah, it's also that one of the things that I have always felt that the Asian American community has been victim of is a questioning of fundamental Americanness and citizenship. And so, but the only way to combat any of this is by using that. So can we talk about civic engagement for a bit? What kinds of steps are being taken to really engage people civically? What is the response? You've said that, keep your head down, this model minority myth. How does that get shaken off? How do you activate that?
I think that the activation of voter mobilization and integrated voter engagement has been amazing. We have been, for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, we have been the deciding factor in multiple elections. And I think people were, I have been working in civic engagement for about 30 years, and you see it's the involvement in the store owners in Chinatowns. It's the involvement of low-wage workers. And I think all of these organizations that have been working on civic engagement and doing door knocking and going, from business to business and talking to community members about their rights to be able to vote, and then to organize folks around voting. Pew Charitable Trust just did a wonderful survey, national survey. And what they found in this last election, was one of the biggest turnouts for Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. One of the biggest motivators to vote was racism and what was occurring and how the community was portrayed. And so I think that it is, people talk about you've woken up a sleeping giant. I think we've been around doing voting for years, but I think we're going to see in the next election, it's even more powerful. It wasn't just young people voting, it was older adults. It was, soccer moms. It was folks that really care about what's happening. And so it was easy to motivate. We called about 80,000 voters, as well as organizations from across the nation were working so hard and calling and doing phone banking and text banking and social media. So it's really exciting what's happening. And it's great to see all of our pipeline of Asian American Pacific Islander leaders in office who have come from that and were young organizers or coming from the community and now in elected office.
Yeah, Priscilla, because we can't see you, I can't get body language. I want to make sure to let you in. Do you want to comment on civic engagement, political power?
Sure. Thank you, Jill. We could easily have a whole nother session just on that, particularly where the three of us live in still a very purple Orange County. I think we're known nationally as, we I think really landed on the political map back in 2018 when we flipped 5 of the congressional districts. But then in 2020, 2 of those flipped back. And what's interesting is they flipped to 2 Republican Korean women. And so, just with that statement alone, just knowing that obviously we are not a monolith. Our community is quite complex, depending on not just on ethnicities, but obviously political viewpoints and what issues people care about. We do a lot of progressive organizing between our organizations and as a community. And certainly, even at the local level, we encounter other Asians who don't have the same belief. But I think what's common behind all these stories is regardless of political affiliation, a lot of them are just eager to have their voices heard, right? It's the door knocking and the outreach that Marianne mentioned. Um, one of the things that happens so frequently that we hear about is other Asian American voters or household members saying, nobody has ever reached out to us before. Um, this is the first time that, somebody has asked me or tried to educate me about this particular issue or ballot measure. It just, Asian Americans have not traditionally been part of the quote unquote target population when it comes to these elections. So, there's still, and then on the local level, we are still actually very much Republican controlled Board of Supervisors and City Council. And so, the strategies are different and the partnerships look different there. But I think one thing that is interesting is that, I think there's a perception that Asian American communities don't like to talk about race. Obviously, that's not true, as Marianne shared with some of the data. But we're seeing that locally even now, currently with our Board of Supervisors recently held stakeholder sessions over a 2-week period. And this was a mandate that was put down through the Board of Supervisors in response to anti-Asian racism and hate incidents here, but also to engage BIPOC communities because of the trauma and the violence that's also affecting those communities. And it was incredible talking with some of the folks who have helped design that process. There is a hunger on the community level for Asian Americans and also other community members to talk about racism and racial violence and racial terror. The stakeholder meetings had hundreds of people participate in every single one. And so, I think that's also an indication of, again, where we are politically and in terms of potential for civic engagement. People, if we create those spaces and opportunities for people to learn and to connect, they will come.
Yeah, we had an opposition to Asian hate rally with Coca-Cola, employees of Coca-Cola, and a young woman, Asian woman, got up to speak, and she had her cards and she was shaking. She was so nervous. She said, "I can't believe I'm doing this. This goes against everything, every fiber of my being, but I'm also so proud to share my story with you." And people, other people were just weeping. They felt this kind of blossoming of feeling that power. I want to shift it a bit to talk about remedies. So President Biden announced a range of actions, reestablishing the White House initiative on Asian American Pacific Islanders, dealing with domestic violence issues, a task force to deal specifically with coronavirus fuels hatred. And then the Senate passed an anti-Asian hate discrimination bill that overwhelmingly passed. Are these the right actions? Are these enough actions? Is that the right level? Ellen, you work in very targeted local community.
Yeah.
Are those helpful to you? Are there other things that we need to be calling for?
Yeah, of course they're helpful. And of course, with the new administration and the climate changing, it is wonderful. It's no secret when your president calls the coronavirus China flu or Kung flu, that Asian communities. I was thinking to the last conversation, fear and rage are powerful motivators. and I think that's what we've been collectively feeling, but more needs to be done than that. That's just a start. It is, there was a lot of symbolic stuff that happened after Atlanta. Everyone stands with Asians. But some of us leaders went, well, then what? And then we started looking very closely at different things. I know Marianne and I and Priscilla, we were analyzing the level of philanthropy to Asian nonprofit organizations. And we looked locally at our philanthropists locally, and they had funded less than 1% of their funds to Asian organizations when a quarter of our population is Asian American. And we went, oh, and I think that, you know, I'm hearkening back to the Oscars and Oscars so white tagline. I think in every corner of our country, we are starting to look under the covers and take a microscope and really look at, are they just words, or are there going to be actions that behind those words? And I think we are just starting to discover how much it has just been just words. We're in the midst of it.
And how is the data on things Asian American? You know, is there data that you can show the progress now? Has it been disaggregated and all the other things you need to do to count how things have gone down and how they need to change? Are you finding that you're able to benchmark where we've been and where we need to go?
I think the benchmarking is just starting. And I think we are discovering that we have a long way to go. And disaggregation is a whole separate issue. We can spend hours talking about disaggregation of data, but that is, of course, a start. That needs to happen in our community to respect our diversity, to respect our stories. We're just not this random census monolith that we are lumped together.
All lumped together.
As. Yeah.
Right. And, you know, for the white community, you know, if you would lump Czechoslovakian Americans, Polish Americans, Irish Americans, and Italian Americans, people would be like, but they're so different. Mm-hmm. Because that's familiar to them, you know, and it's the same for every community. There is no monolith. If you're going to study a problem, you have to understand how it impacts everyday people. Marianne, the policy situation.
I think it's good that, you know, we're really appreciative of President Biden and our Asian Pacific Islander congressional leaders who really fought for, I think, national policies. And then within our state of California, we have an Asian Pacific Islander legislative caucus also made up of state senators and assembly members who really wanted to do something where they would put money behind it and to make change. And so they pushed 13 bills as well as put the money behind it around especially language access. And so when we look at the data of hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we were seeing people were like, well, you know, it's not as much data as we saw. And just what you talked about, there was no disaggregation of data. There was not data collected around the types of hate that were occurring. And so nonprofits and a university got together to stop AAPI hate, to start to collect that data. Now that really helped us. Having that disaggregated data and having the data helped us to influence at a congressional level as well as a state level, and to document and show the need of resources and what to do. And then community leaders organized around what are community-based solutions. One, we need to have reporting in language. How can you report if you don't speak English well? And what happens if you're afraid of the police? You're not going to report it to the police, or if you're going to feel criminalized. And so our California state legislators are putting about $130 million over the next 3 years behind the work, and to look at having better reporting, disaggregated data, mental health support, victims assistance, as well as changes in education, law enforcement, all sorts of things. And so it's putting those resources behind it. In addition, I think what's going on is the challenges. We have this great policies, resolutions, and other things from the federal government. And then we have, investments and legislation from state government. How's that going to work out locally? Are we going to implement that? And what Ellen talked about, having challenges on a local level, it's still trying to educate mainstream groups who would be involved in this about language access and appropriate language access. It's not using Google Translate. We've heard that over and over. People say, oh, I have language access. You know, we use Google Translate. I'm like, that doesn't do anything. We just had an issue where a victim's assistance was offering, support in language, and the therapist was young. And so her language was not to the level of where a community member would truly understand the mental health issues. It's really hard to be, medical interpreting and to interpret healthcare as well as mental health. And so looking at how you have these wonderful policies and resources behind them, how are you implementing it and how are you gaining support on a local level is, I think, our next challenge.
Yeah. Priscilla, I'll let you.
If I can,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, to jump in, I think, Stop AAPI Hate, which is that National Reporting Center Marianne just mentioned, I think is a perfect case example of how crucial the data and the benchmarking piece is. We see the statistics and the data reporting coming out of that center. Actually, yesterday they released the latest numbers. We've seen them has become the national source of statistics on anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents. So as of yesterday, the numbers are 6,600 incident reports between March 19th of 2020 to March 31st of 2021. If you take a look at the report, which you can access on stopaapihate.org, it breaks it down by location. Most of these incidents are happening on public streets and parks and also in businesses. It breaks it down by age. A number of the folks reporting are actually young people. And then, by ethnicity and also by sex. So women right now comprise 65% of those who are reporting these hate incidents. That also shows, so we absolutely need that data. We are collectively, as a Asian American community of advocates, we are so grateful to the groups who had the foresight to create this and have been following it. But it also shows the failure of our governments in terms of being able to document and track these reporting incidents. We've certainly seen that on the local level. There will be some state investments to try to make improvements on that. But without these, data collection measures, we just can't adequately understand the scope of the problem. And even still, we know that there is underreporting, right? Underreporting of hate crimes and hate incidents is very common across any racial or gender demographic. And then I also just want to mention, I think as we are certainly, as Ellen and Marianne said, optimistic about the strong executive orders and bills that have been introduced on the federal level. But at the same time, there is just so much that hasn't been done. There's been so much time between, since the last time that Congress or any administration has really taken proactive measures to really try to build and dedicate more resources to the Asian American community. Just 2 days after the Atlanta shooting, the House Judiciary Committee had a hearing. It had been scheduled already on the books to talk about anti-Asian hate. And I was listening to that hearing, and somebody mentioned that this was the first hearing in 34 years that Congress has had focused on Asian American issues. It's the first time in 34 years that Asian American issues and voices were being centered in a House Judiciary Committee hearing. That is absolutely unacceptable. That is, I think, demonstrates kind of the level of invisibility and silencing that we often feel and have felt for so long. And so, my very direct answer to your initial question is no, it's not enough. There is so much more that needs to be done. you know, people from the community, community leaders like us are bursting at the seams with ideas for what can be done. And so we're eager to work with policymakers to really try to push that.
Super helpful. I'm going to open it up to questions. Um, you can do it on the chat, on the Q&A, questions from our participants, for our participants today. It is actually a shock to hear that a non-governmental organization is the one that compiled this data. It's so fundamentally a government responsibility. I find that a very telling fact. The congressional hearing one is also amazing. And this idea of invisibility, I wonder, do you have leadership, electing leaders is a huge part of that. Is there a huge effort to recruit candidates and run candidates for office?
Yeah,
you see that in
absolutely.
California.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, to develop a pipeline and to elect folks that really reflect who we are. But I think I also I was thinking that one of the things that was really surprising, or we knew, but that is being enunciated, is also the failure of those who should have been our allies. And I am talking about, Marianne touched on that, other nonprofits or other NGOs, because when you have change, people are uncomfortable. And the Asian American community is asking for change, is actually demanding at this moment in history. And that requires folks that should be our allies at times to change. And that could be very uncomfortable. And that's been very eye-opening for me, at least personally. I'm talking about, for example, our local human relations commission. This should be a natural ally. I've been amazed at how much dialogue is happening with that group around centering us where it should be a given. And the local philanthropists or so change. I mean, we are just at the beginning. No, of course the senators passing that is great, but we're in for decades of work, I believe, in the Asian American community.
We have a question from someone who's online. How do you speak to our young children about anti-Asian hate? Advice.
So this is Priscilla. I have two young children, 4 and 8. My 8-year-old has actually a pretty good vocabulary when it comes to talking about racism and discrimination. And I did that through books, right? Books are a great teaching tool. He attended many of the Black Lives Matter rallies with me last summer. So he also got to see and witness from a safe distance, how you show up and how you are an ally for other communities. But this one, I will say, I have struggled, and the way that I've approached it is kind of at two levels. One, I am pretty active as a parent with other parents who are Asian American or have positioned themselves to be allies to really try to push our school district to start with something simple like making a statement, just acknowledging that Asian American students, their families, and their staff are under stress, and to offer some resources. The school districts have actually will either have already or will be receiving quite a lot of COVID relief funding. And there's a lot of discretion in how that funding gets used at the district level. And some superintendents, like in Anaheim Unified School District, they are being very creative in using that money to offer more mental health and leadership opportunities to support students and their families, for example. And at the other level, it is, going back to having these personal one-on-one conversations, and where what I've done, and this is just for my family, is to talk about scenarios, like literally having scenario plannings with him. He's still distance learning, but he will be going to in-person summer camp. And one of the fears and anxieties that I have, and I know many other Asian American parents share, is, you know, as wonderful as it is to have our communities reopening, it also means increased risk of violence, of bullying, of taunting, especially for our kids. And that's a very painful reality. And so I want him to be prepared, and know what to do and who to talk to if he's in that situation and I'm not close by.
Yeah. Ellen, Marianne, advice?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think very,
We're older parents, Maria.
yeah. Well, I think I'll give an example of what my parents did for me, because I had undergone a lot of racism. And it's similar to what Priscilla said. My mom gave me civil rights books, and she had a lot of discussions with me. And then she talked about the Equal Rights Amendment. My parents were very different. But they would have these honest conversations about what it was like for them to grow up and how they experienced racism and discrimination. My mom was placed in an internment camp, and she talked about that experience coming back. And she would point out all the stores that would not allow her and her family in, and how groups, like certain groups, wouldn't allow them to join as children. And she never, let me forget those things. The other thing is, I think when, for my older son, when he was in high school, when Trayvon Martin was killed, I asked him, are they talking about this in school? And is it right now? They were reading the piano lesson. And I said, have they talked about what's been happening? Because they could relate this back to the lessons in the piano lesson. And he goes, no, my school doesn't talk about this at all. And so it's finding out how to have those discussions and what's going on, and also relating it back to why isn't the school teaching or discussing this, and having these, having students think about these things and integrate it into their work. And so I think you're taking every opportune time to have those conversations around the dinner table or in the car with your children.
Yeah.
Yeah. As Priscilla was talking, I was just reflecting, of course, on my childhood, and my father is a feminist, which is very rare for an Asian in his nearing 90. But many of my friends had stereotypes of what an Asian woman should be imposed on them growing up, and had spent a lot of time fighting that, or conforming to it. And so I think as parents, it's really, really important as Asian parents to love the humanity and individuality of that child. I think when we all do that and know that we are loved for who we are as individuals beyond our race, I think the world will be a better place. It's easier said than done, because as parents, we carry a lot of baggage, and we have expectations about our children, and we have fears for our children, but it's for them to just grow up as freely as who God or their maker made them to be, and to be really proud of that and not have any shame in enunciating that to the world. Then we'll be okay in 20, 30 years. So it's very basic.
I think it's good advice, not just for parents, but everyone can listen to that about how we view other people. We're going to end on that. Ellen, Marianne, Priscilla, thank you so much. This has been a really rich conversation. And it's been a delight to have you join us at the center for this. Thank you all for joining us today, and sign up for our newsletter or look out for us the next program that we'll have. They're typically on Fridays at noon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.